Okay. Well, God bless you and welcome everyone to our continuing study of the foundations that are laid out in the book of Genesis. So far, we've made it to, we're at Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, and I'm prepared to teach all the way to Genesis 2:17. We'll just see how far we get with the time that we have. We're going to be talking about events of the garden in the Garden of Eden, which is the land of Eden. We're going to talk more about Adam and Eve and what soul life really means. Try to really communicate a depth of soul life because it's really misunderstood, especially with mainstream Christianity and the immortal soul and all that stuff. So we're going to get into that and a bunch of, we're going to talk about soul life, as I said, more in the garden. We're going to talk about the divisions of the continents a little bit. And we're going to say, where in the heck is the Garden of Eden, right? Does anyone know where it's at? And we're going to talk about Ethiopia and a bunch of stuff. So I wanted to give you just a brief overview. And so that's what we're going to get into. So if you'll take your app or your Bible, we're going to start in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. I'm going to set me up here and make sure that's good. And oops. Let me see. Sometimes I press the wrong X, but that's okay. It'll take me just a second here, guys. Bear with me. Oh, there we go. Everything I wanted to see is there. Good. All right. So we're in Genesis. I want to share my screen here a minute. And as soon as I'm happy with this. Okay. That looks pretty good. And so I'm going to share. And we're, of course, using the Revised English Version, which I'm sure you all we've been using all along. And I use a lot of different sources. There's a lot of great stuff in the commentary, a lot of great work that's been done. Also listen to videos and teachings from other organizations that all have something to say on these subjects. And these are wonderful subjects. And when you think about it, guys, one of the greatest things that are keeping people from the Word of God, I think, are the age of the earth, evolution, those types of things have a tremendous negative effect on people. Kids will say, well, you say the Bible is only so many years old and my science teacher tells me it's not, so I guess you're wrong, or whatever it might be. So as I've said before, we're giving some foundational truths here so you can answer some questions that come up with young people and older people that for those who really want to believe, this will help them. So we're going to start here in Genesis 2 and in verse 5. Before any shrub of the field was in the earth, and before any plant of the field had sprung up, because Yahweh had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground, springs went up out of the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. In the King James Version and a couple other versions, it'll say a mist, like M-I-S-T, a mist watered the earth. Well, a mist actually comes down, from clouds, fog, stuff like that, where springs actually go up. And so it looks like the better translation is springs, and that water is actually coming up out of the ground. And what is happening, and it's going to water the whole face of the earth. Well, let's talk about that a little bit too. And you guys are all familiar with springs, I would think. But just to talk about a little bit, when we built our cabin here way back when we had to dig a well, when he dug the well, water started coming out of the ground. I said, oh, great. This is an artesian well, is what they call it. An artesian well where there's enough pressure below that the water comes to the surface and that flows out. Other people would call this a spring, but normally springs are naturally occurring. I have a creek that runs in our front yard that goes all the way up into the mountains. And one time my son and I hiked to see, well, where's this water coming from? And then we found this little channel coming out of the ground on one side of the mountain and another channel. And next thing you know, we saw 4, 5, 6 springs were feeding this stream. And so this is a spring-fed stream. Matter of fact, you go down and check the temperature, it's going to be right around 30 some odd or 40 some because our water's kind of cold. And so that gives you an idea of what was happening in the Garden of Eden. Water was coming up. Was it coming up in just one spot as a spring? Was it coming up and saturating the soil somehow beneath? But we do know it came up enough because it seems like they were actually springs, because the next verse is going to make this clear. And everybody knows water runs downhill. That's the only way it can run. It can only run downhill. So springs went up out of the earth, and we're talking about this Garden of Eden area, and watered the whole face of the ground. So we're going to talk more about this, and we're going to see where this water goes and how it ended up watering the face of the ground. But let's get into Adam and Eve. And just a second before that, life requires water. And there's kind of symbolic imagery here that it would make sense that life would come from the Garden of Eden. That's where he made man and woman, and that's where the water came out, and nothing can live on this planet without water. And so water came originally from the Garden of Eden, and from there it watered the earth. And how did it do that? We'll talk about that in a little bit here. So, but water is life-giving. It flowed out, and we know the names of some of the rivers. We're going to look at it, and it's interesting that it came out of not only here, but there seems to be a parallel on this whole thing. And I'm not going to expand this completely, but we'll just look into what the word says, and then we'll just kind of go from there. Let's take a look at Ezekiel chapter 14. Ezekiel 14. And here, this is Ezekiel, but not 14. Always thinking turns here. Okay, let me do it this way. There we go. Ezekiel 14. You guys are going to be there, and I'm still getting there, but I'll get there in just a second. Okay, Ezekiel 14 and in verse 8. And I will set my face against that man and make him astonish the sign and cut him off. Whoops, I guess I was in the right one before. It was 28. Let me go back. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. First of all, we're going to go to Zechariah. Yeah, that's a place you don't necessarily go every day, but we're going to go to. I usually have all of these set up so I don't have to spend so much time. But anyhow, this is the way we're doing it this evening. And Zechariah, it's Zechariah Z-E, and it's 14 and in verse 8. And in that day, living water will go out from Jerusalem, half of it toward the eastern sea and half of it toward the western sea. It will be flowing in summer and winter. So you've got in that day, and this one is talking about the millennial kingdom, there's going to be water coming out of Jerusalem. And in other places, we'll find out it's from the temple area. And the eastern sea is the Dead Sea. And we talked about that when we were doing the Bible Lands tour in the photos. It is due east of Jerusalem. But there's a mountain there. There's there's some mountainous regions in there, but that's okay. It's going to make it. And then it's going to go to the Western Sea. Now, the Western Sea is a Mediterranean. So you've got two seas, the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And it talks about in other places that this is going to be, they're going to be filled with all kinds of wonderful fish. So it's interesting, too, that this Mount Moriah there's so much symbolism and parallelism throughout the Bible. It talks about God being the most high God. And we'll get into that in another session. And it talks about it being Eden that is on that side of that mountain. And then it talks about the flowing of the water out of the Garden of Eden. then it also talks about the water flowing out of the temple. And it's almost like there is a parallel here between millennial kingdom and what's happening on earth, where the location of the temple is in the millennial kingdom and this garden. And there is also a Garden of Eden in heaven. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Let's take a look at Ezekiel 47. So Ezekiel 47. There we go. And in 47, and in verse 1. Then he brought me back to the door of the house. Now, the house is this oikos in the Greek. And it's oftentimes house and temple are used so interchangeably in the Old Testament, even in the New. Remember the day of Pentecost? And they were talked about the people that were in the house. And that's why people think, oh, it's a house. That's why they were in the upper room of the house. That's where they received the Holy Spirit. Well, no, the temple is also called house. And behold, the water was flowing out from under the threshold of the house, the temple, toward the east. And we just read about that. For in front of the house faced toward the east. And that's which way the temple faces when you go to Jerusalem and visit it, or you know from what we've taught here recently that the temple faces east toward the Mount of Olives. And the water was coming down from below the right side of the threshold of the house, south of the altar. So there's the altar. We know where that is. We know the altar is. And then he brought me out. Okay, this is Ezekiel. And he's being brought out by the road of the north gate and led me around by an outer road to the outer gate by the road of the gate that faces east. And behold, the water was trickling from the right side. So you can see where we're at, the gate that faces east, and the water was trickling out of the right side of this gate. When the man went out east with a line in his hand, he measured 100 cubits and led me through the water. Now we're talking about the depth of the water that's flowing out of the temple. This is very interesting. I'm not sure all the depth of the reasoning, but here it is. Again, he measured 1,000 feet, led me through the water, and it was to my knees. So before it was to the ankles, and now it's to the knees. So it's getting deeper. And again, I measured another 100 cubits or 1,000 cubits. And so when we say 1,000 cubits, roughly a foot and a half. So we're talking maybe 1,500 feet-ish, and led me through the water, and it was to my waist. Again, measured 1,000 cubits, and it was a river that I could not cross, for the water had risen deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be crossed over. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? And then he led me and brought me back to the bank of the river. Now, when I had returned, behold, the bank of the river, there were many trees on one side and on the other. Then he said to me, this water flows out toward the eastern region, and it will go down into the Arabah. And Doug was there, and Carolyn was there, and we were there. We know where the Arabah was, and that's toward the Dead Sea. It'll go to the sea. And that water was made to flow out of the temple. It will go into the sea, and the water of the sea will be healed. Well, the Dead Sea right now is dead. It's not healed, but it's going to be healed, and it's going to be made sweet. So every living soul, in the next verse, that swarms in every place where the rivers go will live, and there will be a great multitude of fish, for the water has gone there, and the water of the sea will be healed, and everything will live wherever the river goes. And fishermen will stand by it, from the Engedi down to the Eglalim, and a place for the spreading of the nets. It will come to pass that their fish will be of many different kinds, like the fish of the great sea, which is the Mediterranean, a great variety. But its swamps and its marshes will not be healed. So you're going to have some marshes there on the edge of the Dead Sea, and he's not going to heal those because he knows we need salt. And that's so nice. He's going to leave some marshes so we can gather salt. The people who live in that area, you know, the 12 tribes will be there. Jesus will be there. We'll be showing up there. We don't know exactly where we'll spend all of the millennial kingdom, but we know that people will be alive, and these mortals that have survived the battles of Armageddon are going to be eating, and they want to eat some fish, and they like salt on their fish. And so by the river on the bank and on this side and on that side will grow every tree for food, whose leaf will not wither, nor will its fruit fail. And it will bring forth new fruit every month. It bears its fruit every month. This is quite a tree, 12 months out of the year, because the waters issued out of the sanctuary and its fruit will be for food and its leaf for healing. Well, who needs to be healed? Well, those people who live in the millennial kingdom that are still, that survive the battle. They're still mortals, flesh and blood, sin nature, and they're going to have some need to get some healing. But this is almost, it almost gives you the idea of we're getting back into a paradise situation, like Jesus said to the guy on the cross. He says, verily, I'll say to you, you're going to be with me in paradise. I think that's what we're seeing here. So then, and if you'll take a quick look here to, we're looking at Revelations now. Now we're going to move on beyond the millennial kingdom, and we're going to switch to the everlasting kingdom. We're going to switch here to, if we look in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. I don't know if John Shainheit handled this. I know some of you just finished the class on Revelation that John taught. We're going to look in 22. This is the last chapter, and this is where we're moving into the everlasting kingdom as we wrap up the millennial kingdom. And in verse 1, and he showed me a river of water of life, bright as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and the Lamb. There won't be a temple in the everlasting kingdom. There'll be this gigantic city. Is it 1,200 or 1,500 miles on either side? I mean, that is from New York all the way to the Mississippi. So I asked John Shane, I said, how can that be? And it's just as tall. I said, that's outer space. We're in outer space. You get that tall. And he says, yeah. He says, but AJ, this will be on the new heavens and earth. Who knows how big the new heaven and earth will be? It's got to have a lot of room for a lot of people. A lot of people lived on earth these last 6,000 years. Right now, there's 8 billion, and we don't know how many people have died. We don't know how many people have made it from the Old Testament believers, or how many, and we don't know when Christ is coming back yet. How many people? So it could be very large. So I thought, well, that's a good answer. That kind of makes sense. So in the middle of the street, and on this side of the river and on that side, was the tree of life, bearing all manner of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the trees were healing of the nations. And there'll be no curse anymore, and the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it. So that's where they'll just sit. They'll sit on their thrones. There won't be a temple. We'll be able to approach him, and his servants will serve him, and they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And then there will be no more night, and we've talked about this, and there will not be any light from a lamp, nor light from the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So this we talked about. God gives the light, and this looks similar to what happened in the Genesis 1:1 record, where there was light. God said, let there be light, and that light was there before he made the sun. So that gives us some information here that's kind of interesting. So let's go back to Ezekiel 28. All righty. That's not it. I tell you, I'm sorry, guys. There it is. My eyes just kind of pop over it, but that's all right. Verse 28, chapter 28, and we're going to look at verse 13. Start with 13. Now, this is God talking. He's going to talk about the adversary. Son of man, take up. Now, he's talking to Ezekiel about this king of Tyre. Now, you'll remember the prince of Tyre. Remember the prince of Tyre that gave the angel a lot of trouble, that was trying to make it to Daniel? Remember that? Daniel prayed, and it took a certain, I forget the next exact number, if it was a week or 2 weeks, 14 days, for the prayer messenger angel to get it to Daniel, because the prince of Tyre was giving a hard time. Now, this is the king of Tyre. This is the daddy. And this looks like this is the adversary himself. And so son of man, take up a lamentation over the devil, the adversary, the king of Tyre, and tell him, this is what the Lord Yahweh says. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and beauty, perfect in beauty. And I know we've read this record again, but I don't know if we read it in this way. You were in Eden. We're not talking about the Garden of Eden on earth. Look at its description. It's the garden of God. Every precious stone adorns you. Jewels, topaz, emerald, crystallite, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and beryl. Gold work of tambourines and pipes was for you in that day that you were created. They were prepared. You were the anointed guardian cherub. That's the kind of angel he was. We know of cherubim, we know cherubs, seraphim, cherubim. And now this one was an anointed guardian. So this is a big deal. And I placed you there. Where? In this Eden area, the Garden of Eden. You were on the holy mountain of God. That's where God resided in his most high heavens. You walked up and down in the middle of the stones of fire. There weren't any stones of fire mentioned in the Garden of Eden on earth, but this garden there was. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your merchandise, they filled the midst of you with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you out of the mountain of God as a defiling thing. Now, this doesn't mean he's cast him out of the mountain. This is where God lives, and this is where there is this other Garden of Eden that's on this mountain of God. And as a defiled thing, I've expelled you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. And your heart was lifted up because of your beauty, and you have corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. I have cast you to the ground. I have laid you before kings. They may see you. Now, that's a futuristic thing. By the multitude of your iniquities and the unrighteousness of your trade, you have profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore, I'll bring a fire out of you in the midst of you. It will devour you and turn you to ashes in the sight of all those who see. And so this is that God is reiterating, all the original prophecy that went way back to when Adam and Eve first sinned, and the prophecy of what Jesus Christ would do him. And here it is elaborated. But the interesting thing here is we have a mountain of God, and we have this Eden that's on the side of it, and we're seeing some type of parallels. Now, I'm not going to develop that fully, but we might do that at another time. So let's go. We've read that. Let's go back to Genesis, and in Genesis 2. And we're going to talk about some rivers here in a little bit, but in Genesis 2:7, and Yahweh formed, okay, so these springs, we talked about the springs that went out water the ground. We'll get into that further in a little bit. And Yahweh God formed man of the dust from the ground. Okay, so you got dust of the ground, which is dirt, whatever you want to call it. He forms man. Now, he forms a man, the way I see it and picture it, okay, you've got this man that's fully formed. It's not a baby. He's not an adolescent. He is mature man laying on the ground, looks like a human being, but he's not alive. So if you've ever, it could be like someone that has, maybe, have you ever seen someone that, I don't know, I won't get into that, but that's what he looked like. He looked like somebody just lying on the ground but wasn't alive. So what God did, he just made him out of the dust. He's made this full man, and then he breathes into his nostrils. So God takes this fully developed man, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and then man became a living soul. So you've got the formation out of the dirt, and you've got the life-giving breath that God put into his nostrils. And the word is actually nostrils. It's not like, it's just nostrils, the holes in his nose. And he became a living soul. And so now, this is, God is actually elaborating on what he had done earlier. And let's jump forward here to Genesis 3:19 and take a look at this. I think this just gives some more detail. Um, so, uh, so by the sweat of your face you will eat bread. This is after the fall until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you return. So this just reiterates what we just saw here back in 2. He's dust. He's formed out of the ground. So Adam came to life, and they were the first and only 2 people on the face of the earth. And we are all related. It's such a wonderful thing. The Bible says all nations are of one blood. Let's take a look in Acts chapter 17. Um, Acts 17 and in verse 26. Okay. And from one man he made every nation of humankind to live on the face of the earth. So from this one man, having determined their appointed season and boundaries of where they live. And so this is from one man he made every nation. And so the soul life that you and I have originated in Adam. It is the same passed down soul life. It wasn't made again. It's only been made once, and it gets passed down. And so we can see this as we look at the history of the human race, and the Bible reiterates this over and over. And you've seen the genealogies, like Christ, Adam was said to be the first human. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 3. Luke 3 and in verse 38. And the son of Cain, and it goes on to show, all right, here's all the different, we're going through a genealogy here, as you can see. And Jesus himself, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son of, as it was assumed, of Joseph. He was actually Joseph's stepson. And then it goes through all the dads, Joseph's dad, and all these different names. As you can go down, there's another Jesus happens to be there. And then it gets to the end. And I mean, it's actually, we're going backwards. We're going backwards from Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, all the way back. And look, here we go. The last line, son of Enos. And then before Enos was Seth, and before Seth was Adam. And Adam was made by God. He was the son of God, the man that was formed and breathed the air into his, the life into his lungs. So, and you'll find other places where God points humanity back to Adam. Okay, let's take a look at it. Galatians chapter 5. And chapter 5, verse 17. For the flesh that sets a desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, these are opposed to each other, with the result of that you are not doing what you want. So what we're talking about here is sin was being passed down. When Adam and Eve sinned, that spirit, that sin got passed down through all mankind. So, and this is, just more reiteration of how there was an original man, and this original man was Adam. He sinned, and it was passed down. Let's take a look at Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5 and in verse 17. For if by the transgression of the one man death reigned through that one man, we can be much more certain that those who receive the overflow of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So we have the contrast of the one man, Adam, and we show the one man, Jesus. We die because of Adam, that we reign in life through the one man, Jesus. And so, and that elaborates. So then, just as through one transgression, the result was condemnation for all people, and that was Adam's, and it went all the way down. So also through one righteous act, the result was righteousness that brings life to all people. What a wonderful summary. When you think about Adam sinning and all this stuff in between, you know, these approximately 6,000 years, and or actually 4,000 before Jesus Christ, and then 6 to where we're at. And then we read this verse the other week, for just as through the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man, many will be made or declared righteous. So great stuff. That's Adam blew it, and Jesus Christ got us out of the soup. Okay, now let's talk a little bit. We're going to back to Genesis, and we're going to talk about this soul life because it's such a huge, huge subject in today. And man became a living soul. So he breathed in life, and man became a living soul. So what is soul? You know, God had given animals life, and therefore they became living souls. But this is the first time humankind had become a living soul. So it's different. It's different in that before it was animals, now it is people. Now, people say, well, what is the soul? Some people, they got all kinds of wild ideas about it, and I know you've heard about it. You know, is it some kind of ghost? Does it inhabit our body? What happens when we die? Does it die? Does it go to heaven? Does it go to hell? Does it wander the planet? People over in Cimarron, New Mexico say one lives in one of the rooms in their hotel. They've got one over there, and then there's another place in Taos. They got another one over there. So you've got all these ideas about what happens when you die, and people make money saying there's one that lives here. And so what happens when a person dies? That's the animating part of their life, and without it, they're dead. So soul is a very interesting subject. So it's two Hebrew words. One is suke and one is nephesh. You're both familiar with both those things, so I'm not going to get into it that much. But what happens to it? Well, the quick and easy answer is it dies. It no longer exists. So it was there, now it's not. And so the idea of it living on was a concept that was, you know, Aristotle and a bunch of Greeks got into that. And then you know about Alexander the Great in 325, I think it was BC. He conquered Israel and the whole world pretty much there. And so they're philosophers. Everybody wants to know when you die. That is a huge subject in mankind. We weren't the first to think about it. Everybody has thought about it. What happens when you die? And these very elaborate things have been developed by philosophers and throughout the ages. And so you have Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers, because you know the Greeks, you know what they did. They loved to talk about some new thing. And so they came up with this. They believed that Alexander conquered Israel. They taught, a lot of the Jews got involved with it. They developed it. And even in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation from the Hebrew Bible into a Greek Bible, they tried to figure out the Greek word for death was Sheol. The Greeks had no such word that just simply meant you were dead, because they didn't believe you really died. You either went to heaven or you went to hell. And so therefore they used the word Hades to be Sheol. But with the word Hades, that drags in a whole lot of baggage. Then hell has all kinds of things that go along with it, which is tormenting, you know, devil lives there. That's where you go when you're bad, all this stuff. Hell does not exist. It is a mythological place developed by the Greeks. What does exist is Sheol. And what is Sheol? That's what God calls the place of the dead. It's not a physical location on the earth. It is a state. It is a state of being. What is it? You are lifeless. You are dead. There's no body. There's nothing. All there is your life. Everything you did, everything about you, how you look is all in God's perfect memory. That's where you are stored. You're stored until that day when Jesus comes back. If we don't make it until the return, poof, he puts us right back together in the design of a way that we were originally designed. And we have that spiritual body. We have the knowledge. We will know as we are known. We will see him as he is. We saw what Jesus would look like after he was raised from the dead. We didn't see him, but we know about him. That's like us. So you've got this place of Sheol where people, that's what it is. And I think it's easy to understand. The Bible uses analogies about it's like sleeping, and in certain ways it is. And if you've ever been in a surgery, boy, when they put you out, you are out. Next thing you know, you have no concept of time. And a lot of us, especially when we were young, the same thing happened to us when we went to bed at night. We slept, and next thing you know, 8, 10, 12 hours went by, and we had no idea what happened. Don't remember it unless you had a dream or something, but time stands still in your mind. And that's how it is with death. Time stands still. And so it's like sleeping. At the end, it's very similar because in sleeping, eventually, guess what? You wake up. The same thing in death. Eventually, you wake up. God wakes you up, puts you back together. So what is this soul thing, and why? I told you some of the stuff on why it's such a weird thing, how it's been taught, and that's simply it. When you die, you die, and that's what happened. So we're going to get into this a little bit further, but I want to get back into. We're going to talk about soul more, and I'm going to give you some real logical things that'll help really solidify the soul thing here. So I'm going to share my screen again. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 7. So here we go. Man's on the scene, and guess who's coming up? So Yahweh formed men. We just read that. And then God planted this garden. Now, we talked about this earlier on in Genesis 2, but he's reiterating it. And he's saying Yahweh had planted a garden in Eden. Now, notice it's a garden in Eden rather than a garden of Eden. So the garden is actually planted in a place called Eden. So that adds a little bit more to the depth of your understanding. Here's this place that's called Eden, and Eden means delight, right? And we're going to talk about it. Means very wonderful. It's pleasant. And there was this garden there, and he put the man there whom he had formed. So what's that tell you? Well, it tells you that Adam was not made in the Garden of Eden, right? Eve is, but not Adam. And I tell you, those of you, you know me, and I know, I like John Eldredge and his book, Wild at Heart. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about that because he talks about the image bearing of men and women, and he does it in such a beautiful, inspiring way. He says, Eve was created with the lush beauty of the Garden of Eden. But Adam, if you'll notice, was created from the earth itself, from clay, from the dirt. And in the record of the beginning, in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, makes it clear, I'm quoting from his book here, man was born from the outback, from the untamed part of creation, outside of the garden. Afterward, he was brought into Eden. And ever since then, when boys they've never been at home indoors. And men have had an insatiable longing to explore. We long to return. It's when most men come alive. It's when they're in the outdoors. And John Muir said, when a man comes to the mountains, he comes home. The core of a man's heart is undomesticated, and that's good. My gender seems to need little encouragement. It comes naturally, like our innate love of maps and 1260, Marco Polo headed off to China. And in 1967, when I was 7, this is John Eldridge speaking, I tried to dig a hole straight through down to the ground in my backyard to see if I could find China with my friend Danny Wilson. We gave up after 8 feet, but it made a great fort. Hannibal crosses his famous Alps. Then there comes a day in a boy's life when he first crosses the street and enters the company of the great explorers. Scott and Edmondson race for the South Pole. Perry and Cook vie for the North Pole. And when I gave my boys some loose change and permission to ride their bikes down to the store to buy a soda, you thought I had given them the charter to go to the equator. That's how guys are. Magellan sails due west around the tip of America. Despite the warnings, he and his crew will drop off the end of the earth, and Huck Finn heads down to the Mississippi, ignoring similar threats. Powell follows the Colorado River into the Grand Canyon, even though because no one had done it before, and everyone is saying it can't be done. So he takes off on this story, this record of Adam being made outside of the garden, and insinuates that that's why we are in part the way we are. Women were made in the slush garden. We are kind of rough on the edges and made in the wilderness. So it's nice. It's not totally perfect analogy, but it's nice. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at Genesis chapter 2. Share my screen back at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2 or 21. We're going to talk about the woman here. And Yahweh caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs. Now, there's discussion if it was really a rib. You know, some people say, well, if it's a rib, how come we don't have one missing? You know, us men, well, if you take a rib from a man, doesn't mean his kids are going to have one rib missing from there on out. But, that's how sometimes we thought. But he took something of this rib, and it could have been from his side, but it would have been in the flesh. Now, you see that he's not putting soul. He's making the woman out of the soul that's already there in the man. He closed up the flesh at its spot, and Yahweh built the rib. Then he had taken from the man into a woman and brought her to the man. So you see, there's no breathing of soul life into the woman. The soul life is already in this flesh that he took from the man. And so that's so life exists that way, and it's the same thing that happens even today. When, say, for instance, a carpenter, this is not gory, but, this is part of life. Say, for instance, a carpenter is working and he happens to cut his finger off or his tip of his finger off. And if he does nothing about it, the tip of that finger, what's going to happen to it? It's going to die. But if he gets to a doctor quickly enough, it can be reattached. Well, why? Well, there's soul life in that finger. There's soul life in every cell of our body. And so if you lose a tooth, get a tooth knocked out in a fight or a car accident, you get it put back in soon enough. Before the cells break down, it takes cells, it takes a structure, a viable structure to support soul life. When that structure can no longer support soul life, it dies. So if it's a cut off finger, if it's a cut off tooth, if it's a cut off arm, you can cut off appendages, and if stuff is put back soon enough before the soul life dies, it's reunited. So see, this is giving you more insight on what soul is. It is every cell in your body, and they're dying all the time. But do these cells go to heaven? No, they don't. But for some reason, when a person dies, does his soul go to heaven? Well, no, it just dies, just like if you cut off a finger. And I mean, and that's just the reality of it. And it helps us understand. That's what soul is. Now, life has movement in it. It has, respiration. there's different things that indicate your life. Now, life was passed on from Adam to all men, and this life is passed on through Adam's seed. So men produce all these seeds, millions of them, and they all are one cell. They're called sperm, and they have a little tail on them, and they are alive. But and so their goal is to impregnate that egg, and that egg is alive. So and Dr. Wierwille had it right when he talked about in PFAL that the life of mankind is passed through the man. That's where it comes from. It comes from the man. The egg is ready to receive that soul life. And if it works, then you have the beginning of a life form. And that life form it begins to duplicate. It actually, it was time as people were saying, well, it's not, you don't have soul life until you breathe. Well, fetuses breathe. They just breathe through their mother's lungs. The air from their mother's lungs goes into that body, and that's how they get their oxygen. And then the day they're born, a valve flips in their hearts, and then they start using their lungs for oxygen. Just happens just like that right after they're born. And then you hear that cough, and that's when it happens. That's when they take in and they start breathing on their own. But up until then, they breathe from their mom. So if a mom is in a car wreck or sometimes she passes, unfortunately, the baby dies of suffocation unless they get him out quick enough. They can get him out quick enough, if it's full grown enough, and they can give him air, he'll survive. But that's what happens. It requires air. And so you have this situation that this is how life is passed on. You cut off a finger. Heart transplants. You take out a person died for some reason and their heart's good and they decide to donate it, it's removed. And if it's done quickly enough, that soul life remains in that heart. And it goes into the body and it connects to it. And there is an infrastructure that will support soul life. So that body continues to live. And livers do that. And it has to be done quickly. So the soul life remains in the heart or in the cut off finger for a while, but eventually it dies. And we need to think of soul on a cellular level. If we think of soul on a cellular level, I think it really helps us grasp the idea of soul and soul life. So, okay. I think I've just said about enough on that. And I think that's clear, and we can talk about this more if you'd like to. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. And in Genesis 2 and in verse 8. Okay, so the man just got put in the garden, and Yahweh said, made every kind of tree. Now, this is a reiteration of 7 in the chapter 1. Every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. So he made the trees pleasant. You guys know that, giant sequoias, redwoods, oak trees. If you're in the Midwest, you've got these wonderful dogwoods. They have blooms on them. They're beautiful. And then he put the tree of life in the midst of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so now we're getting back to this water that came up through these springs. So a river goes out of water, a river out of Eden to water the garden. So a river went out of Eden to water the garden. So our Eden is a place, remember? And the garden is a smaller section within Eden. And from there, it divided into 4 headwaters. So you've got these waters coming out of the ground to water the earth. And just like I talked to you about the creek in my front yard, this is called Frolic Creek. The spring waters come to one thing and they make a river, or a big stream, and this particular stream goes down and connects with the Moreno Valley, the Moreno Creek, which makes a bigger creek, and that flows into our Eagle Nest Lake. And then out of that flows the Cimarron River out towards Cimarron. And so this is what you have coming out of the Garden of Eden. The water is coming out through the springs, it's collecting, and it's making a river. And then this river eventually becomes 4 headwaters. And then the name of one of them is called Pison. It winds through the whole land of Helba, and there was gold there, and gold of the land is good. And then Bellium, that is just another name for like a resin, like myrrh. And then you have onyx stone was there. They're talking about what was there at these rivers. The name of the second river was Gihon. And uh, Doug and Carolyn remember the Gihon spring that was there in Jerusalem, and it means gushing. And boy, did the Gihon spring gush. There was lots of water that came out of that. But they had a second river, and the river was named Gihon or Gushin. It winds through the whole land of Cush. Cush is another place for Ethiopia. The name of the third river is the Hiddekel, and another name for Hiddekel is the Tigris. That's what you're more familiar with, and that's another name which runs out of Assyria. And the fourth river is called Euphrates, and we know about the Tigris and Euphrates. So, but a lot of stuff has happened since the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden was about 6,000 years ago, and so since then you've got it's going to be pretty impossible after the flood to find out where the Garden of Eden is. And really think of it, people have an idea. The Garden of Eden was probably really small. And the reason we can say that is you've got Adam and Eve, two guys or two people, man and a woman, and they don't have a tiller, they don't have a tractor, they don't have a combine, they don't have any of that stuff. And what they have is a beautiful garden that they need to tend because that garden is going to provide them food. So maybe what, 2-3 acres? It can't be large. It can't be too large. It's just too much for two people, right? So it's probably very small. So that's going to make it, if people are still looking for it, how are you going to find 2 or 3 acres in Israel or in that area of the country or wherever it was? We really don't know. So anyhow, we don't know where the garden is. But so God took, in verse 15, God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and care for it. So that was his job, pretty good job. And God commanded the man. So now we're getting into a command. But before I get into the commands, let's talk a little bit about, I want to just elaborate a little bit about why we can't find Eden. And I learned something here. Let's take a quick look into Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, let's take a look. Genesis 10, and we'll look at verse 25. We talked about the original continent we think was probably when God first made the heavens, the earth. Probably it was in one continent when he divided the seas from the land. But there's also another interesting thing here. Whoops, I meant to go into chapter 10. That there's also a consideration here. And I think we just have to think about this, but it could be that there are at least some dividing in the continents before the flood. At least look at this first, see what you think about this. Genesis 10 and verse 25. Then Eber was born. Now we're talking about what are we talking about? Yeah, we're talking about we've got Shem, the father of the children of Eber, and Japheth. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are Noah's kids. And so here we got in verse 25, it says and we're going through the descendants. And we have Eber were born 2 sons. The name, one of them was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. This is interesting. In his days. See, this is after the flood. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but and I think this is after the flood. And I probably should have studied this a little bit further before I shared it with you, but there's some food for thought. Maybe you can look into that. We still know that during the flood, there was a huge amount of tectonic upheaval in movements of the earth. That's where we had the forming of the mountains, where the tectonic plates hit each other. Some went below the substrate, others pushed the earth up. And so you've got the mountains, and a lot of things occurred. With this one continent idea and a vision into the different continents. So who knows where the Garden of Eden is? So we'll just leave that at that. In the Tigris and the Euphrates, why do we have a Tigris and Euphrates now when they date all the way back to 6,000 years? Well, probably when Noah got off the ark, he had heard about the Tigris and Euphrates, and he probably named some rivers after names that were familiar to him. We do that all the time. At least we do it sometimes. New York, the state of New York, is named after a town in England. It's York. There's York, England. I lived in the town of New Bremen, Ohio, which was just outside of New Knoxville, because each of these cities had been in other countries. So it's not uncommon for you to import names from other places because you're familiar with it. So the Tigris and Euphrates, it's a very good chance to just remember those names. And so that's what he named them. But they're not the original Tigris and Euphrates because they flow in different ways. And so they're just different. So let's take a look. And this was to the east. We'll go back to where we were here. And we're going to wrap up here because we're getting out of time. And so I'm going to wrap this up here. But I thought it's kind of interesting here. We're looking in Genesis. And oops. Okay. And he commanded, yes. Okay. So we're going to, I think Yahweh took man, put him in the Garden of Eden, and he worked it. And the Garden of Eden was actually to the east. And so we're going to talk about what that east means and why he can say it's east. And this book was written by Moses. So at the time of the Garden of Eden, Israel was unheard of. But at the time of the writing of this, Israel was heard of. And so he's going to talk about Eden being to the east. And we'll talk about that further. And then we're going to look into next week about the different things in the garden and the commandments of Yahweh and what they could eat of and what they couldn't eat of and why. And we're going to talk about in the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die. And we're going to talk about, did man have Holy Spirit? And is that what died, or was it something else? So today we went through a few verses here in Genesis, learned a few things that maybe we're relearning, maybe taking another look at it, but we will continue our work through Genesis to get these foundations solid in our minds. And it should be helpful as we teach our kids and other people around us. So I'll close with a word of prayer and stop sharing here. Heavenly Father, Lord Jesus Christ, thank you for your love. Thank you for the word that you taught us. And thank you for these deep truths so we can understand, especially like soul life and how man became a living soul and how he was indeed the first man and he passed down his soul life to the soul life that each of us have in our bodies right now was originally given to Adam, who then the second person to have it was Eve, and so on. So we're thankful to know that. We know how you are looking to bring us back into this wonderful paradise. We want to get there too as soon as you want us there. But in the meantime, our goals and purposes are in harmony with yours to get men saved and come into a knowledge of the truth, the full understanding of the truth. And that's what we are doing tonight. We're working to come into that full knowledge of the truth that you have said that that's what you want. And so that's why we're doing this. So thank you for your people tonight. Bless all of our hearts, our lives. Give us a good night's sleep. Thank you for all the prayers you're answering and the ones you will continue to pray, answer for us. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Okay, I'll stop sharing.